Welcome to the Carolina Weather Group. We're happy to have you this evening, and we're going to be talking about some fun stuff tonight. I know all of you who are listening are big fans of winter weather and snow, and tonight we're going to have on with us Judah Cohen. He's a climatologist, and if you follow weather Twitter, I'm sure you've seen Judah's tweets throughout weather Twitter talking about the polar vortex and different winter seasonal outlooks. And so tonight we're going to kind of dig into that, talk about what the polar vortex is. We talk about it every year where we see these intrusions of cold air. So we're going to kind of talk about that and also kind of look at the seasonal outlook for this winter of 2022, 2023, and kind of see what Judah thinks may happen over the next few months. So let's jump into the program. We have Shay Gibson and Frank Strait on with us as well as our panelists. So Judah, welcome to the Carolina Weather Group. We're happy to have you. First question to you that we always ask a lot of our guests is, how did you get interested into weather? What's that one storm or maybe that one person or something like that that really got you interested in weather and wanting to pursue this crazy career that we're all involved in?
A pleasure to be here, and thank you for that question. I think anybody that knows me won't be surprised that it's the love of snow that got me, into meteorology. I don't know if that it was one storm, but certainly the storm that that really maybe just got me hooked was February 1978. It's actually, I live in Boston. It was probably most famous for what it did in Boston, or Eastern New England. I grew up in Brooklyn, and it was about 2 feet of snow there as well. So quite a storm, much bigger than anything I'd really seen, previously.
Judah, looking into this winter, if you're looking into your forecast, kind of give us an overview of what you think we could expect for the winter of 2022, 2023. I
look at Arctic predictors. And the one that I've looked at the longest, I think probably best known for, is looking at snow cover extent, how much of the land is covered by snow across Eurasia, but in the month of October. But in October, that's mostly limited to Siberia. The more snow in Siberia in the fall, but especially October, the greater the likelihood of getting a cold winter in the eastern U.S. Less snow in Siberia, and we tend to get a more, no predictor is perfect, but more likely to get a milder, less snow type of winter here in the eastern U.S. Yeah, there are other things. I also look at Arctic sea ice. So I do think that's also, I've come to that later, and other people have looked at that as well. Less sea ice, so more snow cover favors a weaker polar vortex and colder weather. Maybe that seems intuitive, but less sea ice means the same thing. So less sea ice means a weaker polar vortex and colder weather. More sea ice, since maybe it's a little counterintuitive, because you say, well, it's more sea ice, should be colder. But more sea ice means a stronger polar vortex and milder weather. And colder weather maybe for the Arctic, but milder weather for us here in the mid-latitudes. So if they happen on the North Atlantic side, I think that is more favorable for disrupting the polar vortex and getting cold weather, especially across the whole hemisphere. But if it happens on the North Pacific side, actually, there's been some studies that could actually strengthen the polar vortex. So I do think, given the pattern, I think that actually, I didn't think this a couple of weeks ago, but I think it now, that actually the bigger anomalies will end up being in that region that's most favorable for disrupting the polar vortex, kind of near Europe. If you look at the two Arctic predictors I look at more closely, they're kind of a wash. They kind of balance each other out. So far I think the Arctic is not showing its hand too well.
I wanted to ask, we always hear the Siberian connection with snow, and that being a stronger winter pattern for the U.S. in general. So what is the connection? Why is that?
Yes, I was describing earlier the waves. So another way you could think, so the waves can take different forms, but one thing could be like a temperature wave. So Eurasia, each continent has it causes its own, what we call a standing wave, kind of this wave that's kind of set in place. And it has to do, in a large part, some of it's topography, but a large part is because it's much warmer on the western side of continents, and this is both true for North America and Eurasia. It's warmer on the west side, because if the winds blow in from west to east, so like Seattle, right? Seattle is milder than Portland, Maine, right? Even though they're probably close in latitudes. I'm sure if anything, Seattle's further north because Seattle's getting winds that are constantly coming off the North Pacific, and in the winter, the ocean is a big heat reservoir, so it's much milder. So this, and then as you move east across the continent, it gets colder because you're getting much less and less of that maritime or ocean influence. You're getting more of that continental, kind of cold air coming down from the Arctic influence. So snow cover, so Siberia is on the east part of the continent, right? Let's say Europe's on the western part of Eurasia. And snow cover in the fall typically falls across Siberia, so the eastern part of Asia. And snow cover is the highest naturally occurring reflective surface. It's the most reflective naturally occurring surface on Earth. So more sunlight gets reflected into space. So that tends to lead to colder and colder temperatures. So you have more snow, more sun gets reflected into space, it gets colder and colder. So you're kind of amplifying the cold, the trough or the cold part of that wave. And then this is where sea ice comes in. I said the sea ice that tends to, sea ice anomalies or departure from normal, where sea ice is missing, let's say, or not anomalously extensive. The most important part is across close to Europe, Scandinavia, the Urals. It's called the Barents-Kara Seas. So if you that sea ice is melting, you expose the open waters to the atmosphere. That heats the atmosphere. So you have heating in the warm part of the wave because less sea ice, and you have cooling in the cold part of the wave because of more snow cover. So that amplifies the wave, right? This naturally occurring wave across Eurasia. And the same thing happens across North America, but smaller. So that's why I think Eurasia is most important, because it's, size matters here with this. We're talking about the polar vortex.
Living in the Northeast, where you're much more susceptible of snow and cold, than us here in the Southeast. Kind of tell us about the elements of winter. How does this polar vortex that we hear from time to time, especially from the mainstream media, it's always one of those big news stories when we see this intrusion of cold air. Talk to those viewers who may know a little bit about weather or may not know about weather at all, and kind of explain the polar vortex 101, and then we can kind of dive into certain sections of that and then go into what you may think's going to happen here this upcoming winter season.
The polar vortex is an area of low pressure. And like all low pressures in the Northern Hemisphere, the circulation is counterclockwise. It sits typically centered over the North Pole, and it's pretty high up in the atmosphere. So in the stratosphere, I'd say 5 to 15 miles above the Earth's surface. And in its normal state, it has this fast flowing ribbon of river of air that kind of circumnavigates or circulates around this, low pressure center over the North Pole. And it's a jet, so it's similar to, I don't know, people familiar with the jet stream, but it's higher. It's separate from the jet stream and it's higher level, but it's a very fast flow of air. And I like to give the analogy, it's like a top. So in its normal state, it's a fast spinning top. Kind of quiet rotation keeps everything kind of close to the core center. So, obviously, since it's in the Arctic, there's a lot of cold air that's, kind of associated there in the core and the center, and it keeps it close. So it tends to be cold over the Arctic, but much milder in the mid latitudes. Now, that's the kind of the most common and normal state of the polar vortex. But there are times when it gets disruptive. So you go back to this analogy of the spinning top. It's like spinning top bangs into something, right? So then the rotation or the circulation really slows down, and it starts to wobble and meander, kind of moves all over the place. So that's what happens with the polar vortex. The circulation around it becomes slower, and it kind of develops these undulations or kinks. It's not just circular anymore, and the circulation associated with the polar vortex spreads further south. So it's kind of also another analogy, like maybe the ice skater, when it's fast, nice rotation, and he or she keeps the arms, closer to chest. When they start to fall and the arms start to flail, and they really slow down. So that's what's happening kind of with the polar vortex. And that's when the cold air, if you think of the polar vortex in its normal state is like a dam. It keeps, dams all the cold air close to the Arctic, and then the dam bursts and the cold air will just rush to lower latitudes. And that's when we typically get our cold air outbreaks and even snowstorms.
What sort of things would make the polar vortex shift or dive into one sector or quadrant of the planet from that perspective?
Yeah, so I think if you boil it down, the most basic feature in the atmosphere that controls the behavior of the polar vortex are waves in the atmosphere. So just like we have waves in the ocean, right? And if you're sitting, in the certain, you guys in the Carolinas, I'm sure you spent a lot of time down at the beach. You're standing there in the surf, you got a little wave, little ripples coming across, it's not a big deal. It doesn't have a lot of energy associated with, but you get big swells coming in, let's say, hurricane offshore or something. You're going to go into that surf. Those waves are much bigger. They have much more energy. They're more likely to knock you down. So the same thing happens between the waves in the atmosphere and the polar vortex. If the waves are kind of small in the atmosphere, not much amplitude to them, that's the term we would use. But the waves get big enough, then it's like that top that's spinning nice and quiet, tight rotation. It starts to get really knocked around when the waves get big, large, sufficient size. And then it'll start to kind of, meander and wobble, and it'll go to, and I like to say where the polar vortex is, so is the coldest air.
As far as like when we talk about oscillations, maybe let's talk about oscillations, what those are. And then you're talking about positive, negative, Arctic, North Atlantic oscillations. So kind of give us some scope of like what that term means and what you're gauging for forecasting.
I like to think of the North Atlantic oscillation or the Arctic oscillation kind of a metric of how much mixing is going on in the atmosphere. So when the North Atlantic oscillation, let's say, is positive, that means there's very little mixing going on, right? When you have this positive North Atlantic oscillation. So the cold air stays up north, the mild air stays south. And, so certainly the southeastern US is going to be mild in that type of scenario or regime.
All righty then. Well, I guess I'll go on and ask the quote unquote fun questions here, which basically are just to get to know you a little bit better as a person and not just as a meteorologist. But I guess I'll start by asking you, since you're from the Boston area, tell us something that a person visiting Boston really needs to do, something they shouldn't miss.
Faneuil Hall and Quincy Market and that area I think is really nice area to walk around. Downtown Boston. A lot of people take the Freedom Trail that takes you on different parts of Boston, back to the Revolutionary War.
So another question I typically ask is what's your favorite restaurant and what's a good place to go grab a meal?
Yeah. So I observe kosher diet. And Boston is like a desert. It's really coming from New York. That's maybe my biggest disappointment.
What's a great place to eat in New York then, since you're familiar with that?
I guess I tend towards meat, so I like some steakhouses. So there's Reserve Cut in downtown Wall Street area. It's really good. And actually in Brooklyn, there've been 2 restaurants I've gone to recently that were really surprising. I thought excellent. Bordeaux. Actually, not too far from where I grew up in Brooklyn, in the Midwood section of Brooklyn. And when I was there was nothing great either, but it's really turned around for whatever reason. And in Borough Park, there was this loft that was a really great steakhouse as well.
Well, Judah, we appreciate your time. If our followers and listeners want to follow you on social media or a website, how can they do that?
I'm pretty active on Twitter, Judah47, at Judah47. Should have gone with something like Snow Cone. And then when I got on Twitter, I signed on. I didn't think I'd ever use it for very much. So I was wrong about that. So people say, what kind of name? Judah47? Could that be really you? It was really me. So, and I have a weekly blog. So it's a bit of a long name, but if you do Google search Judah Cohen blog, I'm sure it'll be the first thing, or Judah Cohen Arctic. It'll be the first thing that'll show up.
Judah is a must follow on Twitter. If you're not following him, you need to do that because you'll get some really good specific ideas of what may be coming down the road, especially in the wintertime, as we
Thank
really
you.
get into that season. So Judah, appreciate your time tonight and a great conversation. And again, go follow Judah on Twitter. And for everyone here at the Carolina Weather Group, we hope you have a great evening. We'll see you back here